The world had shrunk to the size of my apartment. It was a comfortable cage, insulated by the hiss of the radiator and the low hum of the refrigerator, sounds that had replaced conversation. My job as a freelance transcriptionist for medical journals didn't help. I spent my days turning disembodied voices into neat black text, a professional eavesdropper on lives I would never intersect with. Loneliness wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a chronic condition, a dull ache in my bones I had learned to live with, like a bad back or a trick knee. My routine was my anesthetic. Wake up, coffee, work, microwave dinner, stream something until my eyes burned, sleep. Repeat. The only real variable, the only time I felt the phantom limb of human connection, was once every 3 weeks. My haircut. Julian's barbershop was an anachronism, a pocket of the 1950s tucked between a vape shop and a gentrified cafe that sold $10 toast. The name on the window was simple. Cuts and shaves, no clever puns, no trendy graphics. Just honest, declarative text in gold leaf. Inside, the scent of talc, bay rum, and old leather clung to the air like a comforting ghost. The chairs were heavy beasts of worn burgundy leather and gleaming chrome, solid and dependable. Julian was the same. He was a man of few words, his movements economical and precise. He'd been cutting my hair for 4 years, ever since I moved into the neighborhood, and I probably knew less about him than I did about the cardiologists whose symposiums I transcribed. But I observed. I knew the way a small muscle in his jaw would tick when he was concentrating on a difficult line. I knew the exact shade of his eyes, a deep, mossy green that seemed to absorb the light. I knew the sprinkle of silver at his temples was more prominent under the harsh fluorescent lights of the shop than it was in the soft light of a cloudy day. I knew the quiet rumble of his voice when he'd ask, same as usual, Leo, and the way my stomach would perform a nervous little flip every single time. He was, in the barren landscape of my social life, an oasis. A dangerous one, because my feelings for him were a seed I had foolishly allowed to sprout in the dark, a secret, impossible thing that I tended to with stolen glances and overanalyzed pleasantries. It was a crush, plain and simple, but it felt more like a low-grade fever, a constant warmth under my skin that I could never quite shake. It was manageable because it was contained within the strict boundaries of our 30-minute appointments. I was the client, he was the barber. I sat in the chair, he stood behind it. The mirror was our mediator, a safe distance through which I could watch the careful, steady movements of his hands, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a perfectly balanced, perfectly safe, and perfectly miserable arrangement. Then, on a Tuesday night that was indistinguishable from any other, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging me from the edge of sleep. The screen glowed with a number I knew by heart, but had never dared to use for anything other than booking appointments. Julian. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. Had I left my wallet there? Did I schedule something by mistake? I swiped the notification open. 2 words. Chair free. It was exactly 11:57 p.m. The message was absurd. Nonsensical. A barbershop isn't a taxi stand. A chair isn't free at midnight. It was a mistake. He must have meant to send it to someone else, a friend, a late-night poker buddy with a similar name. Liam. Leon. Leo. It was an easy mistake to make. I should ignore it. Turn my phone off, roll over, and pretend it never happened. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But my body was already moving. My legs were swinging out of bed, my feet finding my jeans on the floor. The routine was broken. The anesthetic was wearing off. The dull ache of my loneliness was sharpening into a point, and it was pointed directly at that 2-word text. What if it wasn't a mistake? The question was a spark in the kindling of my quiet, desperate heart. The possibility, however remote, was too potent to ignore. I pulled a hoodie over my head, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled for my keys. I didn't text back. I just went. The city was asleep. The usual roar of traffic had dwindled to the occasional whisper of tires on wet pavement. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that made the familiar walk feel alien and charged with meaning. My own footsteps echoed back at me, a lonely percussion counting down to what? Humiliation? A simple misunderstanding? Or something else? Every step was a battle between the cautious, sensible part of my brain that screamed this was a terrible idea and the starved, hopeful part that was running the show. I saw the light from a block away. A single, warm rectangle of gold in the dark facade of the street. It was the light from the barber shop. As I got closer, I could see his silhouette through the large plate glass window. He wasn't with anyone. He was just standing there, slowly sweeping the floor, the broom moving in a steady, meditative rhythm. He looked calm, not like a man who had made a mistake. He looked like a man who was waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was my last chance to turn back, to melt back into the shadows and return to my comfortable cage. I could be in bed in 10 minutes, and this would become a strange dream I'd dissect for weeks. But my feet kept moving, carrying me forward until I was standing right in front of the glass door. He looked up then, as if he'd sensed my presence. His sweeping paused. Our eyes met through the glass. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look confused. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He leaned the broom against the wall and walked to the door, the bell above it giving a soft, muffled jingle as he unlocked it and pulled it open. "Leo," he said. His voice was the same low rumble, but here, in the dead quiet of the night, it sounded different. Deeper, more intimate. "Thought you might be up." The air from the shop washed over me, that familiar, comforting scent of bay rum and leather, but it was sharper now, less diluted by the daytime hustle. It was concentrated Julian. I stood frozen on the threshold, a trespasser in a sacred space. My mind, usually a torrent of anxious chatter, was completely silent. I couldn't think of a single thing to say. "It's, late," I managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in my mouth. He just nodded, his green eyes holding mine. That steady, unreadable gaze I knew so well from the mirror. But without the mirror between us, it felt incredibly direct. "Stripping. Couldn't sleep," he said, a simple explanation that felt like it held a universe of meaning. He stepped back, holding the door open wider. "An invitation. Come on in. It's cold out." I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me, severing me from the world outside. The sound was deafeningly final. It was just us. The shop, which always felt bustling and full of life during the day, was now a cavern of quiet and shadow. Only one of the barber chairs was illuminated, lit by a single, low-hanging lamp that cast a pool of warm light on the worn burgundy leather. It looked like a spotlight on a stage. "My stage." He gestured toward the chair. "Needed a trim anyway, right?" he asked, the question hanging in the air with a weight it had never held before. It wasn't just a question about my hair. It was a question about why I was really here. I swallowed hard and walked toward the chair, my legs feeling unsteady. The whole situation was surreal, dreamlike. I was an actor who had wandered onto a stage without knowing my lines. I sat down, and the familiar leather sighed under my weight. Julian walked behind me, and I watched his reflection in the vast mirror that covered the wall. He picked up the black nylon cape, the material whispering as he shook it out. It was a ritual I had been through dozens of times, but tonight, it felt charged, sacred. He draped the cape over me, his fingers brushing the back of my neck as he fastened it. The touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. My skin tingled where he'd made contact. I stared at my own reflection, at my wide, nervous eyes. I looked like a startled animal. Behind me, Julian's reflection was a study in calm. He moved with the same unhurried grace as always, arranging his tools on the counter. The metallic click of scissors, the soft thud of a comb. Familiar sounds in an unfamiliar context. "Same as usual?" he asked again, his voice close to my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the shop's signature cocktail of aromas. I could only nod, my throat suddenly too tight for words. He picked up a spray bottle, and the fine mist of water on my hair was cool against my scalp. His fingers began to work through my hair, separating the strands. His touch was firm, confident. It always was. But tonight, I was aware of every point of contact. The pressure of his fingertips, the slight roughness of a callus on his thumb, the way his knuckles grazed my temple. My entire world had contracted to this single chair, to the space between his hands and my head. I watched him in the mirror. His face was a mask of concentration, his brow slightly furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. It was the same expression he always wore when he worked. But I found myself searching it for something more. A sign. A clue. A confirmation that this wasn't all in my head. That the midnight text and the open door and the silent invitation meant what I so desperately wanted them to mean. But his expression was unreadable, a locked door. The only sounds were the rhythmic snip-snip of his scissors and the soft rasp of our breathing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a long-acquainted barber and client. It was a loaded silence, filled with everything we weren't saying. I could feel my own heart beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm, and I was terrified he could hear it. I was a drum, and the silence was a hammer. He moved around the chair, his body occasionally brushing against my shoulder. Each accidental contact was a small fire that I had to consciously extinguish before it consumed me. I focused on the details, trying to ground myself. The intricate pattern on the handle of his scissors. The way the light caught the silver threads at his temples, making them shine like spun moonlight. The faded tattoo of what looked like a compass rose peeking out from under the cuff of his rolled-up sleeve. I had never noticed that before. How many other things had I never noticed? He began to work on the sides, switching from scissors to clippers. The low, electric hum filled the room, vibrating through the chair and up my spine. He rested a hand on the crown of my head to steady it, and his palm was warm and solid. A brand. I closed my eyes, unable to watch in the mirror anymore. It was too intense, too intimate. Without the visual, my other senses were heightened. The buzz of the clippers was a physical presence against my skull. The scent of his cologne, something subtle and clean, like sandalwood and rain, was intoxicating. The feeling of his hand on my head was an anchor in a swirling sea of anxiety and hope. This is just a haircut. The thought was a desperate mantra. He's a nice guy who couldn't sleep and knew you were a night owl. That's all. It's a kind gesture. Nothing more. Don't make it more. Don't be a fool. But then his thumb moved, a slow, deliberate stroke against my scalp. It wasn't a necessary movement. It wasn't part of the haircut. It was a caress. A question. My breath hitched in my throat. My eyes snapped open, and I met his gaze in the mirror. He was already looking at me. Not at my hair, not at his work. At me. And for the first time, his expression wasn't unreadable. There was something in his eyes. A flicker of the same vulnerability, the same questioning hope that I felt churning in my own gut. The clippers fell silent. He didn't move his hand from my head. The sudden absence of the buzzing sound made the silence in the room feel absolute, profound. We just stared at each other's reflections, locked in a silent conversation that was more honest than any words we had ever exchanged. The mirror was no longer a barrier. It was a conduit, reflecting not just our images, but the raw, unspoken tension that crackled in the air between us. My heart is going to beat its way out of my chest. I am utterly, terrifyingly transparent. He sees everything. He sees the years of quiet pining, the pathetic little crush I've nurtured in the dark. He sees it all, and in a moment he's going to pull his hand away, laugh awkwardly, and I'll have to find a new barber in a new neighborhood, maybe a new city. But he didn't pull his hand away. He didn't laugh. His gaze didn't waver. His thumb stroked my scalp again, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to be calming my frantic heart, drawing me deeper into the quiet intensity of the moment. He was the eye of my hurricane. He switched off the low-hanging lamp above my chair, plunging us into a deeper darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of a small neon clock on the wall and the distant, lonely streetlights filtering through the front window. The darkness was a blanket, a permission slip. In the shadows, the rules of the day didn't seem to apply. "Leo," he said, his voice a low whisper right beside my ear. He was so close now. So close. I could feel the solid presence of his body behind me, the warmth radiating from him. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just watched his shadowed form in the mirror, waiting. He leaned in, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to finish the haircut, to pretend that moment of connection had never happened. But he didn't pick up his tools. Instead, his other hand came to rest on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. He wasn't just touching me now. He was holding me, grounding me. The haircut was over. The pretense was over. Whatever this was, it was something new, something terrifying and exhilarating. He used the hand on my shoulder to gently turn me, not away from the mirror, but to the side, so I was partially facing him. I twisted in the chair, my knees bumping against his legs. The cape was a clumsy barrier between us. Now there was no mirror. No reflection. Just him. His face was only inches from mine, half in shadow, his green eyes dark and serious. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the fine lines around his eyes. He was real. Not a fantasy in a mirror, but a solid, breathing man standing in front of me, his hand still resting on my head like a benediction. He seemed to be searching my face for something, for a sign of protest, perhaps, for a reason to stop. I gave him none. I was paralyzed by a cocktail of fear and a longing so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. I couldn't have moved if the building was on fire. All I could do was look back at him, my own expression no doubt a pitifully open book. After what felt like an eternity, he seemed to find what he was looking for. A small, almost sad smile touched his lips. He leaned closer still, and my world narrowed to the space of a single breath. His scent, the sandalwood and rain, was all around me. I could feel the heat of his body, could hear the soft sound of his own breathing, a little less steady than before. "Hold still," he whispered, the words a ghost of a sound against my skin. And then he closed the remaining distance between us and kissed me. It wasn't a hard kiss, or a demanding one. It was soft, tentative, a question. His lips were warm and surprisingly gentle against mine. It was a kiss of discovery, of confirmation. For a moment, I was too stunned to react. My brain simply short-circuited. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was a dream, a fantasy spun from years of lonely nights and unspoken desires. But then his hand moved from the crown of my head, his fingers tangling gently in the hair at the nape of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind my ear. The touch was exquisitely real. It sent a tremor through my entire body, a wave of sensation that shattered my paralysis and brought me crashing back into the moment. This is real. This is happening. I kissed him back. My own movements were clumsy at first, uncertain. I was out of practice with the world, with connection, with intimacy. But he was patient. He let me find my rhythm, his mouth moving slowly, encouragingly against mine. My hand, which had been clutching the armrest of the chair in a white-knuckled grip, lifted of its own accord. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then rested it on his waist, my fingers curling into the thick fabric of his shirt. I felt the solid muscle beneath, the warmth of his body. He was so incredibly real. The kiss deepened. It was no longer a question, but an answer. A long, articulate sentence in a language I hadn't realized I was fluent in. It spoke of shared loneliness, of quiet observation, of a tension that had been building for years, unnoticed and unnamed. It was the relief of a pressure valve being released, a dam breaking. All the feelings I had kept locked away, all the yearning I had so carefully managed, came flooding out. He made a low sound in the back of his throat, a sound of affirmation, and pulled me closer. My body arched up from the chair, trying to get closer to him, the stupid nylon cape a frustrating obstacle between us. His other hand left my shoulder and came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The slight roughness of his skin was an anchor, the most real thing I had ever felt. I am kissing my barber. In his shop. After midnight. The thought was so absurd, so far outside the realm of my carefully constructed reality, that a bubble of hysterical laughter almost escaped me. But it was swallowed by the kiss, by the overwhelming reality of Julian's mouth on mine, his hands on my skin. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. My lips tingled, my entire body thrummed with a nervous energy that was both terrifying and wonderful. He didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand was still cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking back and forth in a soothing, hypnotic rhythm. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't heavy with unspoken things anymore. It was a comfortable, shared silence, filled with the echo of what had just happened. I was afraid to speak, afraid to break the spell, afraid that if I said a word, I would wake up in my cold, empty bed. So I just stayed there, forehead pressed against his, breathing in his scent, committing every sensation to memory. The feeling of his hand on my face, the warmth of his skin, the taste of him still on my lips. "Leo," he said again, his voice thick, rough with emotion. "Yeah." My own voice was barely a whisper. He opened his eyes. In the dim light, they were dark pools of sincerity. He looked at me, really looked at me, with an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing straight into my soul. "I've wanted to do that," he said, his voice low and steady, "for a very long time." The words were a release, a confirmation. The last, terrified piece of me that was screaming this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, finally fell silent. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was real. It was reciprocated. A wave of relief so profound it almost made my knees buckle washed over me. I felt a laugh, a real, genuine laugh, bubble up from my chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He pulled back slightly, a small, worried frown creasing his brow. "What?" "Nothing," I said, shaking my head, a wide, goofy grin spreading across my face. I probably looked like an idiot. I didn't care. "It's just me too." The worried frown on his face melted away, replaced by a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. It was a smile I had never seen before. Not the polite, professional smile he gave his clients. This one reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and making them shine. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He let out a soft breath, a sigh of what sounded like relief. "Good," he said simply. We stood there for another moment, caught in the quiet aftermath. The awkwardness I had dreaded didn't come. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, of a puzzle piece clicking into place. But the reality of the situation began to slowly seep back in. I was still sitting in the barber's chair, wrapped in a nylon cape. The tools of his trade were laid out on the counter beside us. The neon clock on the wall now read 1:17 a.m. "So," I started, my voice still a little shaky. "What happens now?" It was a stupid question, a vulnerable question. I was laying all my cards on the table, my fear of rejection rearing its ugly head. Julian's smile softened. He reached down, and his fingers fumbled with the clasp at the back of my neck. With a soft rustle, he pulled the cape away from me, tossing it onto the empty chair beside mine. The simple action felt symbolic. He was removing the last barrier, the last vestige of our old roles. I was no longer the client in his chair. I was just Leo, and he was just Julian. He held out a hand to me. "Now," he said, his voice laced with a gentle certainty, "I think we get out of here." I took his hand. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, his grip firm and reassuring. He pulled me to my feet, and I felt unsteady, like a newborn foal. He didn't let go of my hand. He just stood there, holding it, his thumb stroking a slow circle over my knuckles. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more intimate, more binding than the kiss. It was a promise. He led me toward the back of the shop, his hand still holding mine. There was a small, cluttered room behind the main area, with a worn-out armchair, a mini fridge, and a hot plate. It was his sanctuary, I realized. The place he retreated to between clients. He was letting me in. He let go of my hand to open the mini fridge, and for a second, I felt a pang of loss at the absence of his touch. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 clean glasses. He didn't ask if I wanted any. He just knew. He poured a generous amount into each glass, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He handed me a glass, his fingers brushing mine. "To sleepless nights," he said, his eyes twinkling. "And bad decisions," I added, my voice gaining a bit of its old, sarcastic humor. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I don't think this was a bad decision." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the glass. "I think this was long overdue." We drank in a comfortable silence, the whiskey burning a pleasant trail down my throat. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a quiet, buzzing warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol. It was hope. It was the feeling of a door opening in a house I thought was sealed shut forever. I looked around the small room. There were books stacked on the floor, a framed photo of a rugged, windswept coastline, a half-finished sketch of a bird on an easel in the corner. Pieces of him. A life I knew nothing about, a life I suddenly wanted to know everything about. "You draw?" I asked, gesturing toward the easel. He glanced over, a flicker of something like shyness in his expression. "Sometimes. When my hands get tired of holding scissors." He took another sip of whiskey. "Helps quiet my head." "I know what that's like," I said, thinking of my own quiet, lonely apartment, the endless loop of my own thoughts. We were more alike than I had ever imagined. 2 quiet people, living side by side in our own little worlds. only ever meeting at the carefully defined border of a haircut. He finished his drink and set the glass down with a soft click. He walked over to me, closing the small space between us again. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the energy humming between us, a physical force. "My head isn't quiet right now, Leo," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's very, very loud, and it's all saying your name." My breath caught. My carefully constructed walls, the ones I had spent years building to protect my fragile heart, were crumbling to dust. He was so direct, so honest. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He wasn't playing games. He wasn't being coy. He was just telling the truth. "Mine too," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached out then, not to kiss me, but to gently cup the back of my neck. His thumb rested on my pulse point, feeling the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of my heart. A slow smile spread across his face. "Good," he whispered. The silence that followed was charged with a different kind of energy now. The initial shock had passed. The confession had been made. Now, there was the thrilling, terrifying question of what came next. The air was thick with possibility. He was still so close, his thumb a steady, rhythmic pressure on my neck. I could see the flecks of gold in the green of his eyes. I could count the individual lashes. It was an intimacy I had only ever dreamed of, and it was so much more potent, so much more real than any fantasy. My own hands felt useless, hanging awkwardly at my sides. I wanted to touch him, to confirm for a second time that this was real, that he was solid and warm and not a figment of my imagination. I lifted a hand, slowly, tentatively, and rested it on his chest, right over his heart. I could feel its steady, solid beat beneath my palm. It was slower than mine, a calm, dependable rhythm. Thump thump, thump thump. It was the sound of certainty. He looked down at my hand on his chest, then back up at my face. His expression was soft, open. All the stoicism, the professional distance, was gone. I was seeing the real Julian, and it was taking my breath away. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I had to be honest. He had given me his truth. I had to give him mine. "I'm thinking," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "that for the last 4 years, I've been rehearsing conversations with you in my head, and none of them were anything like this." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, and I felt the vibration under my palm. "Rehearsing, huh? What kind of conversations?" I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Stupid things. Asking about your weekend. Commenting on the weather. Once, I spent a week trying to work up the courage to ask you what kind of music you listen to in the shop. It's mostly old soul," he said, his smile widening. "And you never had to rehearse, Leo. I would have told you anything you wanted to know." "I know that now," I said. The realization was both wonderful and a little sad. All that time I had spent in my head, trapped in my own anxieties, I could have just asked. The barrier between us hadn't been his stoicism. It had been my fear. He leaned in and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to my forehead. "No more rehearsing," he whispered against my skin. Okay, I breathed. He pulled back, but he took my hand from his chest, lacing his fingers with mine. His grip was warm and solid. "Come on," he said. "Let's go for a walk. The city is quietest right before dawn." He led me out of the small back room, through the darkened shop. He paused at the front door to flick off the last remaining light, the neon clock, plunging us into near-total darkness. Then he unlocked the door, and the cool, clean air of the coming morning washed over us. It felt like stepping into a new world. The street was empty, washed in the pale, pre-dawn light that was just beginning to bruise the eastern sky. The streetlights seemed to be losing their power, their orange glow fading against the encroaching daylight. It was a magical, liminal time, the space between night and day. The space between my old life and whatever this new one was going to be. We walked without a destination, our linked hands swinging gently between us. Our footsteps were the only sound on the empty sidewalk. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The comfortable silence was back, a shared space that we were building together, step by step. I glanced at our hands. His was larger than mine, the knuckles prominent, the skin weathered. It was a capable hand, a hand that spent its days creating, shaping, and it was holding mine as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A simple, profound act of connection that my lonely heart had been starving for. "I live just a few blocks from here," I said into the quiet, the words sounding loud in the stillness. My apartment. The one with the sad-looking fern in the window. He smiled. I know the one. I've seen you in the window sometimes, working at your computer. My stomach did a nervous flip. You have? Yeah, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. I always wondered what you were writing so intently. Boring medical transcripts, I confessed. Nothing interesting. I doubt that, he said. I think everything about you is interesting. My heart swelled. It was such a simple, direct compliment, but it landed with the force of a revelation. All this time, I had felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. But he had seen me. He had been watching me, just as I had been watching him. We were two lonely people, observing each other from a distance, both too afraid to cross the empty space between us. Until tonight. As we turned a corner, the first, tentative rays of sunlight sliced through the gap between two buildings, painting a golden stripe across the pavement in front of us. Dawn was breaking. A new day. It felt ridiculously symbolic, like a scene from a cheesy movie, but I didn't care. It was my cheesy movie, and it was perfect. We stopped walking, and he turned to face me. The rising sun caught the side of his face, illuminating the silver at his temples and the green of his eyes. He looked tired, but happy, genuinely happy. I don't want this to be a one-time thing, Leo, he said, his voice serious. This isn't just a weird midnight impulse. I hope not, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. Good. He lifted our joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. How about breakfast? There's a diner a few blocks from here that has coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I think I'm going to need it, I said, a tired but happy smile spreading across my face. I hadn't slept, but I had never felt more awake in my entire life. Every nerve ending was humming, every sense was heightened. The world looked brighter, sharper. Me too, he said. We started walking again, our shoulders brushing, our hands still linked. We were heading toward the diner, toward coffee and the start of a new day. But it felt like we were heading toward something much bigger. A beginning. I thought about my apartment, my comfortable cage. It was waiting for me, quiet and empty. But for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the pull to go back to it. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long was gone. It had been replaced by the solid, warm weight of Julian's hand in mine. I realized I wasn't scared anymore. The fear of rejection, the fear of intimacy, the fear of breaking my routine, it had all evaporated in the heat of a single, honest kiss. All those years of being a passive observer, of watching life from behind a window, were over. Julian hadn't just given me a haircut. He had woken me up. He had unlocked the door and invited me out into the world. I looked at him, walking beside me in the soft morning light, and a feeling of profound gratitude washed over me. He had taken a risk, sending that text. He had put himself out there, and in doing so, he had given me the courage to do the same. He caught me looking and smiled that slow, beautiful smile. What? He asked. Nothing, I said, but my own smile was so wide it made my cheeks ache. Just everything. It was the truth. It was nothing, and it was everything. It was a midnight text, a haircut, a kiss. And it was the beginning of my life. I had walked into that shop feeling like a ghost, and I was walking out into the sunrise feeling completely, incandescently real. I felt like I had come home.